Breanne Paul is going to tell us about the Cyborg Olympics, exploring society with superhumans. Take it away.
All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about is kind of what cyborgs are, how we make them. Then I'm going to go into sort of how society is going to react to cyborgs, and then some implications that I've chosen to talk about. It's not nearly all of them, but it's a start. So the first thing we need to do is talk about what a cyborg is. So it stands for cybernetic organism. And if you Wikipedia that, what you'll find is that it's a cross between basically a biological and a mechanical organism. So the important thing to note is that we're kind of already there. I wear glasses, for example. I can remove them, but they're still a part of my identity. So I would consider that still to be like a primitive cyborg. And you also have people who use prosthetics. And so I would say that we're already in sort of the age of the cyborg. And one other thing to note is that you can really augment human function in 3 ways. So the first one is sensory function. You can also have motor function and cognitive function. So because we've been through this, I think, in 5 lectures now, I'm just going to give you some examples of cyborgs. I'm not going to go too in depth, but just consider these sort of examples as we're going. So as the definition says, you can start from either biology to make a cyborg or machine to make a cyborg. So on the left here, you have Hugh Hare. He's a fantastic researcher in this area. He is a person, and he has 2 augmented legs, basically. Okay, and on the right, we also have the Hybrid, which we've talked about in class. It's a robot that uses cortical neurons from a rat, and it kind of gives it a personality, so it can sort of change how it approaches certain tasks, and it kind of affects how it does approach and avoidance tasks. Okay, so we can really create cyborgs from biology or machinery. Okay? So some examples of how we might do this. You can either, well, on the left here we have Jens Neumann, who we'll come back to and talk about. He's one of the first people to actually have a functioning retinal implant. We'll talk about him later though. We can also have motor augmentation. So this is the Exos 2 used by the United States military to augment sort of motor function. They can lift superhuman weights is what they use it for. And then on the right here is called Silent Talk. It's also a DARPA project. The idea is that they're trying to find EEG patterns that they can use to read of like basic communication words that they use in the battlefield. So they're hopefully going to find these patterns they're looking for, and then that will allow soldiers to communicate neurally instead of verbally, which would be an advantage in the field. So one thing that Amy Mullins is talking about is what the future is going to bring for prosthetics. So she, like Hugh Hare, is a double amputee. She had her legs amputated just below the knee. And one thing that I think is really important that she's talking about is she's talking about potential. So what she wants to see happen is, or what she thinks is going to happen is that we're going to break the threshold that's currently on human potential. Disability will become super ability. But in the back here, she has some of her legs, I think she has 12 pairs, and some of them don't actually look like legs. So currently we are in sort of this age where we take nature, we take a leg, and we try to make a prosthetic to look like a human leg. And that's where nature informs design. But the future will actually be more about design informing nature. So nature will work around design. So currently, no prosthetic is as functional as its biological counterpart. So it can do what a biological counterpart can do, but only under certain circumstances. So if you see this ice pick leg, this is one of Hugh Hare's legs. It's better at ice climbing than this leg right here. If this leg wants to ice climb, we need to put on a shoe and a crampon, etc. So it's as functional under certain circumstances, and perhaps more under certain circumstances, but not as universal. And that's where prosthetics is going. So cyborgs of the future will be A, more universal than regular legs, and B, they'll be more functional. So at this point, when, say, a natural leg can do X and Y, a prosthetic leg can actually do X, Y, and Z. So at that point, it will become logical for people to choose whether or not they want to augment their natural function because it's more functional. Okay. So do I really think that at some point people will choose to have, say, their body part removed for a more functional one? And I actually do think that this will happen. Not anytime soon, but in the future, far into the future. It's because people like to use the word better. You've heard the phrase, keeping up with the Joneses, and that's because comparison is natural. It's something that people do. So one example I came across in looking in looking up stuff for this was an environmental company that was looking to increase compliance with, say, turning off the lights, things like that. So they tried the education, like the little signs beside the light switches, said turn off the lights, it's good for the environment, stuff like that. And they found it sort of worked, but it didn't work too well. What they found actually worked better was if they took, say, two branches of the company and they separated them into, say, A and B, and told A that B is actually better than you at shutting off the lights, they found that A actually increased their performance. So comparative feedback is really, really important, and it works really, really well. So what I think this boils down to is if that one group or one person has really awesome technology, other people are going to want that technology, and eventually it will happen. I don't quite think that goes far enough. I don't think people are just going to compare things. So we'll look at another example of why I think this will work in the future. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, but Stanley Milgram's experiments. One thing I want you to pay attention to is the shock machine that he uses. It starts at 15 volts and goes up to 450 volts, and the shocks occur in 15 volt increments. So just watch. Okay, there's a lot going on in that. If you've never seen it before, it's quite shocking. When they conducted this experiment, they only thought that less than 1% of people would be prepared to go all the way to 450 volts. And as you saw in the video, actually, I think 60% were willing to go all the way. And they were trying to make a comparison between the Germans and, say, the Americans, that the Americans would never do that. But in fact, they found that they did. And they've actually replicated this across age, gender, occupation, and it's also been replicated as recently as 2009. So this is a thing. But the important part is that in this context is not that the conformity aspect of it, but it's the incremental aspect. Because when they tried to do this experiment and they just went from 15 volts to 330 volts, the people wouldn't do it. That's barbaric, we're not going to do it. What they found is if they did it incrementally, they went from 15 to 45 to 75 and all the way up, that people would do it. And that's what I think is really important here, is that I think the majority of people will become cyborgs, A, when other people do it, they see other people doing it, it's safe, and B, if there's intermediates. So they're not going to go directly from their biological eye to, say, a robotic eye, but they would go from, say, their normal eye to, say, contacts, then to laser vision, and then like an external implant, then an internal implant, and then eventually to a robotic eye. So something to consider, maybe later in the question period, is if a robotic eye is approved for the mass market and is capable of performing all the tasks that normal eyes do, in addition to performing new ones, for example, seeing infrared or ultraviolet, will people opt to have their biological eyes replaced with these robotic eyes? And I think what we've seen so far is that yes, some people will. Not all, but some people will. So we'll talk about how I think this will sort of impact society, this sort of change. And I think we haven't really come across this before. I think has been notions of, say, enhanced function, but it hasn't been completely true. But once this happens, it will be true. So when technology is good enough that people will want to augment their natural function, you're going to see a couple things. First, you're going to see a universal ability. That's, say, a prosthetic can do X and Y, just like a normal leg can. But then you're going to have increased capacity, so you can see X, Y, and Z. And that's never happened before. Okay. And it's never happened because there's a maximum capacity. So say if I get laser correction on my eyes, I can still only go so far. I can still only get to 20/20. I can't get further, and if you do go further, because it can be done, you'll lose some of the range in the other areas. So you won't have the same capacity that, say, a normal eye will. Are they better? I've stayed away from that terminology in this presentation because better is subjective. So to me, maybe functional capacity is better, but to someone else, being whole might be better. But they will have advantages, and that's the important part to consider. So why does this really matter? Norms will change. If you don't know what norms are basically rules for a group that a group kind of abides by. They're explicit or implicit, but they are very powerful. So say, for example, if you look at people who wear suits, I mean, do they make your performance better? Do they make you more knowledgeable? No, but you see people positioned typically in supervisory positions or power positions wearing suits. It really doesn't affect their performance, yet they still do it. So say if Dr. Soles came in jeans and a t-shirt tomorrow, I mean, what would people do? It just wouldn't be normal, right? And people would talk, who knows? Would it improve or decline his performance? Probably not. Yet, I doubt he's still gonna do it, okay? So say if someone today were to have their arm or leg or eye removed, what would happen to them? they did this on purpose in order to get a prosthetic. Likely they would be medicalized, they'd probably end up with a psych consult, but it's not normal. And I don't think that our society today could accept them to be normal. So if you look in the top right corner, yeah, you can see it. It's the Mueller-Lyer illusion. You've probably seen it before, but you know that these two parallel lines are the same length. So you know that, but you still see the top one is longer. So like norms, even though we know they exist, we still don't go against them. They're still there. Okay, we still follow the rules. And part of this is because, to some extent, our brains are hardwired. Not hardwired in the sense that, yes, I know they're plastic, but hardwired in the sense that we do see certain things across the gamut of people. So the first thing is that we see is prospect theory. It's a decision-making theory, but what it basically means is that when you make a decision, you make it relative to a reference point. So if you make a decision and the result is really good, then you're happy. And if the result is bad, then you're not happy. And in general, people dislike losing more than they like winning. So say you're playing a championship game or something, you dislike the loss more than you would like the win. So what that results in is something called loss aversion. Okay? So people are very averse to losses. So one example of this is the endowment effect, where the original examples of the endowment effect are in wine connoisseurs. So they found that connoisseurs would only pay $35 for a bottle of wine, yet they wouldn't sell it for less than $100. So basically what that shows is that if you have something, you assign more value to it. You like it more. Okay? And something else is called the status quo bias. So people really like things to stay the same. They're kind of afraid of change. And basically what that all comes down to is people have an aversion to replacing their biological body parts. This is why people don't really want to risk losing their body parts, because they like them. And to go even further with that, there's something called the omission bias. It's another cognitive bias. Basically what it means is that harmful inactions are less moral than harmful actions. And it's kind of involves a bit of mental gymnastics. But a really easy example of it is if the result is the same, is withholding the truth the same as lying? So if you ask people, for the most part, they will say that yes, lying is worse. Even though you're starting from the same point, you're ending at the same point, it's just the process. Okay? So now if we consider this question, is it worse to have your perfectly functioning biological hand voluntarily cut off in order to receive a more functional robotic hand? Or is it worse to lose your hand in an accident and receive the same robotic hand? Again, it's only the process that's different. Yet for some reason, people have this insane aversion to cutting off your hand and receiving a better one. Okay? So, and I think it's this choice, this idea of choosing whether or not to augment your body will polarize society. So what that's going to create is the haves and the have-nots. We've talked about it before in the context of developing countries, but I don't actually think that applies too well here because it's an idea of opportunity. So say I'm born in Canada, so I have all these opportunities. If I was born in, say, Rwanda, I wouldn't. It's not the same. I think a better example here is between the Amish and the English, and elitism and egalitarianism. So the Amish exist sort of within our society, but they've chosen to reject technology. Okay, and same with the elitists. They have typically different norms. So you see a lot of different norms with gender. Okay? And what you see between the Amish and the English and the elitists and the egalitarian people is that there's generally separation between the two groups. So we interact when we need to, say if human rights are in jeopardy, but that's it. We don't really cross the boundaries too much. So, and I think then it becomes important to consider, what's humanity? Because if society is functioning sort of separately, who are the humans and who are not? And it's interesting to note because the definition of humanity had to change once, and who's to say that it can't change again? So when they found Neanderthal fossils, they had to change what it meant to be a Homo sapien. So, and I think this is important to consider because if you look at Hugh Hare, he is X% biological. And then if you look at the hybrid, it's X% a rat. I don't think anybody would question Hugh Hare's humanity, but you might question the ratness of the hybrid. And why? I mean, this is still part rat. If someone was 10% human at that point, would they still be human? I think that's something that humanity will have to consider moving forward. And you might say that, okay, fine, we'll reject language, or reject consciousness, or we'll reject this idea of, say, percentages, and we'll move to language, consciousness, things like that. But it doesn't quite work that way, because we do see categorization even at the neuronal level. So I read a study where researchers trained monkeys to categorize cats and dogs, pictures of cats and dogs. And then they got readings from individual neurons, And then they had the monkeys look at pictures, say, of 10% or 100% cat, say 60% cat, 40% dog, and then 60% dog, 40% cat, and then 100% dog. And what they found was these individual neurons could categorize these pictures as cats and dogs. So they still categorized the 60% dog picture as a dog, but they didn't categorize this 40% dog picture as a dog. It was a cat. So neurons categorize. So can you just shut off that categorization that the neurons have? Not necessarily. So I don't think you can completely reject this idea of percentages or humanness because it's still there at the neuronal level even. So I think that moving forward, the haves and the have-nots will begin to value different things. And that's part of the reason that society may fracture. If we can't decide, say, what humans are or say who can innovate and who can't, then I think society may actually fracture, just like you see the Amish here and then the English kind of functioning here. And they interact when they have to, but that's about it. So I threw this in because I think it is worth discussing that there could be problems. We've discussed various doomsday theories in this class, and I don't think we can avoid this one either. So there will be a global split between pro and con enhancement. So some people will be advantaged over other people. And that calls into question things like equality. Are we going to redefine equality? Or is just everybody equal but some are more advantaged? I think that's something we're going to have to think about. And I think it's important because I don't know if any of you have been to Berlin, but this is the square where the Nazi book burnings took place. And it has a really cool monument, so go, I won't spoil it for you. But on the monument, there's a quote, and it says, "Where they burn books, they will also burn people." And I think, that's really powerful. I mean, it speaks to what they did, right? You had, first they went through the book burnings, and then they killed people. But the interesting thing is that quote wasn't actually written about the Nazis. That was actually written about the Spanish Inquisition. So this quote was way before the World Wars even took place. But we did it then. We didn't really learn from it. It happened again. We think we learned from it, but it happened again. Or it happens today still to some degree. So I don't think that we're completely above this happening, say a third time. So I think it's something that we need to consider. I think we can avoid it, and we'll talk about how we maybe can avoid it, but I think it is something that we have to have in the back of our mind moving forward. So now we'll discuss some implications. So the first one is leadership. People have an innate desire to lead and follow. So some researchers took a group of 200 people and they put them in a room, and the only instruction they gave them was to be within 1 arm's length of someone else. That's all they told them. So what ended up happening is the people just ended up swirling around this imaginary point in the middle. It was just a swirling mass. And you see actually the same thing with ants. These ants are just swirling around an individual point for no particular reason. And all you do to create that is you burn the pheromone trail that they use to navigate. So you take away their leader, and then they just end up swirling around an imaginary point. All it shows is that people naturally do this, and animals naturally lead and follow. And the quote, you can. All it says is leadership, all it takes is someone who follows. So I think that moving forward, there will be formal leaders because people like to follow and other people like to lead. I don't know if it's going to be all female or if there's just going to be one, but there will be formal leadership moving forward. And as we've talked about previously in this class, the price of technology is falling. Money is going to, not yet, but money is going to have less of an impact, say, on who's leading and who has power. So I think that knowledge will actually be its successor. So you saw that if you've seen Iron Man 2, we had 2 different exoskeletons. So you had Ivan Vanko's exoskeleton, and then you also had Tony Stark's exoskeleton. And the only thing that really made Tony Stark's better was that he basically invented a new element and powered his suit in that way. So it was actually his knowledge that made that suit better. They both had basically endless funding, but it was knowledge that actually allowed him to surpass Ivan Vanko. And I think that knowledge is going to play a bigger role in moving forward. And a real example of this is Project Daniel. I don't know if you've heard of it, but basically what they did was they took 3D printers to South Sudan, and they taught locals how to 3D print arms for people who had lost theirs. So Daniel, I believe this is him, he lost his both arms when he was 14 during the conflict in Sudan. And so they taught the locals how to print new arms. Okay, and what makes this project powerful is they left the printers there, they taught the locals how to do it, and now they're printing everybody arms. So even though they didn't have the money or the resources, they now have the knowledge to print these arms for people. One more thing I think we should talk about is ethics. Technology is becoming cheaper. Knowledge is becoming cheaper as well. You see that in, say, open source printing. You can get it pretty much anywhere. People anywhere can innovate. If you have the resources, if you have the knowledge, you can innovate in your garage. So who's going to stop that from happening? I mean, formal ethics, in my opinion, will start to play less of a role because how do you formally regulate something that's happening in, say, someone's garage or a private venture? So that's kind of why I threw this in, because I think that regulation is difficult as it is, and I think it's going to become more challenging as we move forward. And the last thing we'll talk about is the notion of responsibility. So we've met Jens Neumann before. He has retinal implant. When he first got the implant, he could see in 100 pixels. So it was really awesome for him. He lost his sight when I think he was 20. But since he's got the system, he can now only see in 6 pixels. So the system has deteriorated quite a bit, which is really unfortunate because the person who was researching and designing this actually died, and then the research stopped completely. So now what happens with this technology? No one really knows how to fix it. So it's kind of stuck. So I think this is something that we're going to have to look at moving forward. We've talked about it in self-driving cars. Say if this car crashes, who's responsible? The driver, the programmer, the manufacturer? We don't really know yet. And that's where it's another thing society is going to have to grapple with. So this is osseointegration. They're making a new bone. Basically, they're putting the prosthetic into the body. But what they're finding is there's quite a bit of infection, rejection, whatever. And it's very difficult because, say, this person has an infection. Who's going to go in and remove that? Especially like in the States, they could be up for malpractice lawsuits because this is not approved. It's very innovative, but it's also very questionable in certain circumstances if it sort of creates a problem for somebody. So that's why I asked the question, does caution stifle innovation? I'm not saying we should stray away from caution, but it could stifle innovation. And we'll come back to what I think about Babel, Platz, and Berlin and the Nazi book writings. I think that potentially we can sort of avoid these doomsday theories because leadership will be based in knowledge. So I think that people will be a lot more informed moving forward, and hopefully we can avoid that. Okay, now coming back to the title. The reason I chose the Cyborg Olympics, because the Olympics is about competition, it's about doing things better, faster, stronger, and it's also about bringing people together, and what I think is really cool. I have a final question to sort of wrap up this talk. If there are 3 versions of the Olympics, the Paralympics, the Clean Olympics, and the Enhanced Olympics, which would attract the largest audience? And would the Paralympics actually be any different from the Enhanced Olympics? So that's all I got. Questions?
I have a question regarding the Q hair and the hybrid.
Yeah.
Do you think, in your opinion, what amount of what we consider to be human or rat has to do with appearance? Because Hugh hair obviously still looks like a human,
Yeah.
and the hybrid doesn't look like a rat at all. Do you think if it did look like a rat, we would be more likely to say this is still a rat?
Personally, I say no, because I mean, does it really matter what it looks like? So I would say no, personally. However, it's hard to ignore, say, neurons categorizing things at individual level. So personally, I think moving forward, we're going to have to get beyond what it looks like, because you see that too with Amy Mullen's legs. She's designing legs that don't look like legs. So what? They're still legs. So I personally say no, that we can move away from that. At the same time, there's gray area. Yeah.
What role do you think competition would play in terms of people being encouraged to enhance themselves? So for example, if a parent sees another child getting physically enhanced, doing better in sports and school, then wouldn't that encourage your kid, you want your kid to be similarly enhanced?
I think that's exactly what's going to encourage it forward. I mean, if you look at, say, hockey, like what drives parents to put their kids in every single camp? Other kids are better. Like, I don't think the number of parents would be putting their kids through tournaments and things like that if there really wasn't this competition moving forward. So I think that's part of what's actually going to drive it forward for the haves. I don't think the have-nots are going to want any part of this. I think they're going to want to stop at that threshold. So, yeah.
If anything were possible, what kind of biological enhancements would you want?
What I want? I think it'd be really cool to fly, actually. And I think the really cool thing about the haves is that I don't think there will be limits on what you can do, because who's to say that someone can and can't do something? So yeah, that's probably my answer. And I think that's where it will go. Anything is possible. Yeah.
For those that are con enhancement, what do you think is going to happen with them? Because do you think there's going to be like superior and inferior like hierarchy building up?
In the have-nots or in general?
In general. In
general, yes, and I think that's where you'll see the separation between the haves and the have-nots. Within them, I don't know. I think within the have-nots, I think you'll see largely what we have today. Like some people are enhanced to some degree, but yeah. Does that answer your question, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Personally, do you see like a point in which you should not enhance further? Like if you reach a point where you're like more than 90% machine, do you think there's a point where you just
So stop.
stop? Otherwise, you're just going to basically turn into a robot?
Do I think so? Not really. I don't think we're going to be able to put limits on that, because who's to say that someone is human where someone who's like 89% human is fine, but someone who's 91% human isn't? So that's where I think that incremental thing will come to play. They're really not going to be able to stop anything, because if someone wants to innovate, they can do it in their backyard. I mean, I don't think there will be a point at which they will stop. Do I think you should stop at some point? Yeah. I mean, I think people are people and robots are something else, but I don't think they will be able to.